Michael E. DeBakey was the man who invented the Dacron Graft, made him famous world over. Well, when Dr. DeBakey was about 95 or something, he was in a wheelchair at the time, and we had a conference, a Wednesday conference, and George Noon got up and talked about Dr. DeBakey's experience discovering Dacron for a graft. They had tried everything. They had taken aortas out of cadavers, dead people that were, and put them in patients, and they would last for a certain length of time, and then they would rupture, fall apart. They would be rejected and get weak, and pressure would break them, and the patient would die. That was a failure. So then they tried nylon. Nylon is strong. It's used for parachutes. It makes great rope, that sort of thing. It's wonderful stuff. When we tried it for sutures, we thought it was great because it was slick and strong and thin. In a year, it melts, And apparently, at some point, they planned to use it to replace aortas when they were aneurysmal and dilated. The first aneurysm was the abdominal aortic aneurysm that they really thought they could replace because it's short and you sew it in. So Dr. DeBakey went down to, I think it was Foley's store in Houston, and he decided he was going to make a graft out of nylon, and this was before we knew that it would dissolve. And he asked the lady behind the counter, I'd like some nylon cloth. The lady said, "Gee, Dr. DeBakey, we're out of nylon. I'm sorry, we're out of nylon, but we have this new thing called Dacron that's an artificial material. Well, give me some of that." So he took Dacron, took it home, used his mother's sewing machine to take a piece of cloth, sew it together, make a tube out of it, put it in someone, and he became world famous as the inventor of the Dacron graft, because for some reason Dacron is not digested by the tissues of the body. It stays, it lasts. So anyway, it was a remarkable accomplishment. And George Noon got up after he had told that story, or he was telling the story, and he made the comment, "Sometimes you just get lucky." And Dr. DeBakey, when he had his time to comment, said, "I think it was Providence." Well, when he dealt with me, he was always dealing from Providence because, I was down here and he was working from up there. Anyway, it was an interesting conference, And now, Dr. DeBakey was at a meeting one time, and we had dinner that night, and I sat at the table with Dr. DeBakey and about 7 or 8 other people at a pretty large round table, and conversation kind of lagged, a little bit, and so I just thought I'd make a comment, and I'd say, "Dr. DeBakey," I said, "Dr. DeBakey, I know that at some point some grateful patient from Italy gave you a sports car. I think it was a Lamborghini or something like that. Wow. Fantastic, And I said, "Did you ever just take that car out and see how fast it would go?" And he said, he said, "One time I did." He said, was driving out on a small road outside of Houston, and he said, I put the pedal to the metal, you know, he said, in just an amazingly short time, I was going 110 miles an hour. 110, just like that. He said it was an amazing car. But he said, I topped this little rise, went over the hill, and this red light came on, you know. He said, oh my gosh, I thought, oh, this is not good. And this is going to hit the newspapers in Houston. Dr. DeBakey is arrested for driving 110 miles an hour outside of Houston. He said, I knew this was not going to be good. He said, I threw on the brakes. I stopped that car before I got to this police car. And he said this very nice young officer came over and asked to see my license, and I showed him my license. And he looked at it and said, are you Dr. DeBakey? You know, he'd heard my name. And I said, yes. And he said, well, Dr. DeBakey, I clocked you at 90 miles an hour coming over that hill. He said, I was so relieved because I figured I could tolerate 90 miles an hour. That wouldn't, but 110 was not going to be good. But this was such a nice young police officer. And he said, no, Dr. DeBakey, I'm not going to give you a ticket. But you've got to slow down. He was such a nice young guy. And so he said, I've never sat in one of these cars. You mind if I sit in it? I said, of course. He got out, this guy sat in it, and it's got bucket seats, and it's, everything is, he said, it's just an amazing vehicle. And, but this guy was so nice. He said, now, Dr. DeBakey, I got back in the car, Dr. DeBakey, keep the speed down. He said, I took off. And he said, the amazing thing is that within 5 minutes, I checked the speedometer and I was going 90 miles an hour. He said, you couldn't tell how fast you were going in that car. 90 felt like 30. It was just an amazing vehicle. But he said, I always, that nice young officer was, sure did me a favor. Well, I always thought, I worked my buns off of him for 5 years. He never called me nice once. This guy got called nice 6 times in 2 minutes. I mean, he didn't treat anyone like he treated his residents. Medical students were treated generously and kindly, and nurses sometimes pretty well, and certainly referring physicians were, he was always gracious to them, but if you were his resident, it was tough. But, you had enormous power as a resident under him. No one wanted to talk to him. They'd talk to you as if you knew what you were talking about. It was great. So that was my experience.